Good morning. I'm your next speaker, John Charles. I'm going to talk to you about the impacts to humans of long-duration exposure to spaceflight factors. I particularly appreciate the title that